Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com or, of course, on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by producer Heather Rae, who recently produced the film Fancy Dance, which will be premiering on Apple TV Plus June 28th. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Um, I'm wondering, so what is it? What are the types of stories you look for, and what draws you to a story as a producer when you're looking for something to produce?
I think that what draws me to a story is when a storyteller has a unique point of view. I am absolutely drawn to stories that are a view into a world that there's some kind of a different way that we're seeing something.
Mhm.
Um, Most of the films I've made have been smaller independent films. um, and films that take us into a world that we hopefully learn something. I've also been working in television. I've worked in the last few years on a bigger show called Outer Range. So I have, an experience that kind of runs a gamut. But even at the bigger end, it's still something that takes us into a world in a different way. So I'm interested in authenticity of voice. I'm interested in unique perspectives. I've definitely had an anchor in my work in social realism and stories that have some kind of, social justice or relevant issue, related to a community or a place or whatever it may be. So I'm drawn to things that also matter.
I've been a camera person for 30 years and I fell in love with cinema. I heard there was free film school in France and I wanted to get into the French film school. I really didn't know anything at the time, but I knew at least how to take pictures. So I said, I'll try for the image department. And then when I miraculously got into the French film school, I fell in love with working with the camera. You're following what's going to be in the movie. So that immediacy that the camera allows is what I loved from the beginning. I'm Kirsten Johnson, and this is my course about documentary cinematography.
It's so interesting because so in the film Fancy Dance, it deals with like a missing Indigenous person.
Mhm.
And I don't know if this uh sort of occurs in the States, but we have a big issue in Canada with missing Indigenous girls. There's a
Yeah.
huge slew of them and the police aren't seeming to sort of search that out. So is that sort of like, was that one of the influences for this, or was that?
Absolutely. Yeah. The MMIW issue exists in the United States in the same way that it does in Canada. And it's also an issue in even Mexico and Central America. I mean, I think it's a phenomenon that exists, in North America without question. And although it isn't specifically what the story is about, the story is certainly about a woman and her niece and
Mhm.
that relationship, and they're navigating the issue of their sister mother being missing. But the writer director Erica Tremblay, who is a Seneca Kiowa woman from Oklahoma, that was certainly one of the motivations for her to tell this story. She wanted that to exist in the background to
Mhm.
understand what it is for people in a contemporary sense to navigate these kinds of issues, which to your point is really it's really not understood or known in a broader sense. So I would say that was part of the motivation for Erica and her co-writer Michiana Elise to write this script.
Hmm. Well, and Erica, if I'm not mistaken, is a documentary filmmaker for the most part. Like, she's done a lot of documentaries. So when you were starting up this, what was it that what did you see in her work that you were like, yeah, this story has to be told, and she's the one to do it?
Erica actually she has a background in the advertising world,
Oh, okay.
which is really interesting. And then she made a short film called Little Chief, which also stars Lily Gladstone, that's somewhat inspired by her mom, who was a teacher in their community in Oklahoma. And so Erica has an interesting background, and she may have done some documentary work in her career in the advertising space. She was supported by the Indigenous program at the Sundance Institute during the time when Bird Running Water was running that program. That's when I originally became familiar with her work, because I've been an advisor for Sundance for many, many years. And there's something really beautiful about the way that Erica sees Indian country. Like, she just has a really unique perspective, and she's a beautiful storyteller and filmmaker. So I was drawn to the authenticity of her voice, but also the kind of elegance that she approaches her filmmaking with.
What's now, and I don't know if this is happening in the US, but in Canada, we're working really hard to do reconciliation and sort of repair the damage and repair the relationships.
Yeah.
And part of that is, making more content about Indigenous people on TV and in films and stuff, so that they can see themselves in the world. I'm wondering, is something similar like that happening in the US? And if not, how do we sort of get to that point?
Well, that's a great question. And I have to say, it's quite unfortunate, but the US has not had the same trajectory of truth and reconciliation that Canada has. Canada has led the charge for some decades. Now, it's mostly been around the residential schools. And in the US, there's the same historic tragedy of the boarding schools. But the United States in general has not really taken on TRCs in the way that other countries such as South Africa or New Zealand or Australia, Canada, the US is really slow in coming around to truth and reconciliation. There was a certain amount of TRC that was done around the internment camps for the Japanese during World War II. And there's never been anything really effectively done to confront the history of slavery in the United States, which we don't share that with Canada. I mean, that's a true, it's one of the original sins of the United States of America. But truth and reconciliation has been slow going. The Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Deb Haaland, who's an Indigenous woman and the first Indigenous person to be in that position in the Department of the Interior, Secretary Deb Haaland has actually begun the process of truth and reconciliation during her term in regard to the boarding schools in the United States. So for the last few years, Secretary Deb Haaland has been traveling throughout the country with a team of professionals, and they've been hearing testimony because it's the same issue. There were hundreds of these boarding schools in the United States, and we know so little about the impact that had on this country's history. It was a collaboration between government and church, the same as it was in Canada. And it's horrific. So I have to say that, to your question, which is such a great question, Secretary Deb Haaland is really the first person to start that process at the governmental level. So it's been slow going. There was a truth and reconciliation in the state of Maine with Native people who had been in the foster care system. And there's a wonderful documentary called Dawnland that tells that story. But the US is, it's, as you know, as a Canadian, the United States is kind of it's an arrogant country. And so it's been harder for this country to deal with this history.
Well, it's interesting because that you say that Canada's been doing well, because on our news programs, we've been talking about how poorly we've been doing.
Right. Well, this is an American perspective. I'm like, we're all going, wow, Canada is so ahead of the game with this kind of conversation.
It's a slow process. But
fair enough.
Yeah. Well, no, and one thing I was looking at interviews that you've done in the past, and one of them, you talked about managing people. Like, when you manage people, you have to manage with grace for success. And I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on that in the context of something as large as a film like Fancy Dance.
Well, that's a great question also. Thank you. Because I'm a big believer in like the distinction of leadership. And I feel like in many ways, it's something that has been missing as a distinction in the entertainment industry. So, for example, if a person is directing a film, they're a manager. They have to
Mhm.
think of themselves as a person who's in a management position. The same would be said of producing, certainly, but also department heads. And one of the things that I've experienced or witnessed in my years and working on, many projects is that quite often people, they lack in those skills and they haven't recognized the distinction of leadership or management, how important it is. I think of it as a skill set that a person actually needs to develop and
Mhm.
pursue it, as you would any other leader. I mean, if you're in management in the restaurant industry, for example, let's just say the food services
Mhm.
industry, you have to be studying management. And you've probably studied it in school. You're going on to do continuing education. You're going to conferences. There's an actual, language and discourse around management. And that really doesn't exist in the entertainment industry. And when I have seen things break down
Mhm.
creatively or literally, it very often has to do with leadership being a missing component. So I'm a big believer in leadership as something that we actually need to be thinking about in a real way and
Mhm.
studying communication and all the things that fall into the concepts of leadership.
Do you think, like, we should bring that in into, like, high school teaching and that stuff, or is that just, like, something
Well,
that
I mean, if we're
wanna go
talking
into
about
today?
it specifically with
Yeah,
the entertainment industry, I think
yeah,
it's something that should be part of film school, for example.
yeah.
I think that Filmmaker U, your platform, I'm
Mhm.
sure that you have various people who are referencing this, but it actually could be its own course, if you will.
Mhm.
And, and interestingly enough, I'm in a master's program right now. I just started it this year and I'm getting a master's in social work. And the reason that I'm doing that is I'm interested in actually creating some kind of a possible system or a set of ideas around how to bring leadership into creative spaces.
Mhm. That is fascinating to hear that you're doing that master's because,
Yeah.
uh, social work and the approach, just the way of talking to people is
Yeah,
completely different from film. So
I
it'll
know.
be interesting to see what you discover and find and bring over in that
Yeah,
world.
I'll
Uh,
report back to you.
Perfect.
I've got a couple of
Um,
years, but
yeah. When you were young, you acted a little bit in, like, community plays and what have you, and I'm wondering, what did you take from those experiences and that you use as a producer nowadays?
well, it's funny that you even found that because I grew up, in central Idaho in very small towns. And there's this kind of funny story that I sometimes tell, but at one point in time, my small town of Idaho City, Idaho, we put on the play Our Town.
Mhm.
And the town was so small that literally everybody was in the play. And I was telling this story recently to my daughter and saying, I don't even know if there was an audience because literally everybody in the town was in Our Town. And I remember that experience so well. And I think it was kind of a formative experience because it was, first of all, it was one of my very first experiences with the dramatic arts
Mhm.
and one of my first experiences with theater. And, I did go on to study theater for a period of time in college. I went to Boise State for a period of time and studied with a dramaturg, Fred Norman, who was just incredible. He has since passed away. But it was a part of my beginning to understand the expressive form of
Mhm.
theater and acting. So I don't consider myself an actor, and I've only acted a few times kind of out of necessity. Like it was
Mhm.
actually more that I was being a good producer and stepping in because there was a need. But what I will say is that it definitely gave me a foundation for having a really deep appreciation for actors. And I consider myself, and I would hope the people I've worked with would agree to this, but I consider myself an actor friendly producer. Like I really care about actors. I feel like actors, it's the one role where in our industry, for example, or the one role in the arts where you're using your body and your being as your instrument. And there's an incredible vulnerability to that. Like there's
Mhm.
a real risk to that. And actually, if people aren't protected in that process, they can be harmed. And so I'm a real believer in kind of having a spiritual context for the work that actors do, and see myself as one of the people who is there to help protect the space that they're embodying.
Mhm.
And so I treat it that way, you know, when I'm working with actors. And I think that part of that, having some experience in my formative years with exploring acting, I think of that as being part of what has shaped me that way.
When we ask them to go into some like tough emotional
Yeah,
places so that
yeah,
we can watch a movie or play, and
yeah. And if
it's a
they're
lot to
not
ask of someone.
supported in that,
Yeah.
particularly as, you know, when it comes time, you know, I think that actors have to have a real process for exercising the character, like letting the character go, maybe keeping the parts of the character that serve them. But I think actors have to have that, the ways that, you know, whether they ceremonialize or ritualize or whatever it may be, sometimes like an actor has to really literally let go of the things that could potentially harm them, you
Mhm.
know.
Now, this is a bit of an aside, but I would love to know, because I'm a fan of theater, so what would you say is your favorite theater piece or play that you got to see or do?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I definitely like theater that is, you know, like one of my favorite movies in my, so let's just say film school years, was My
Mhm.
Dinner with Andre. My Dinner with Andre was a play. You
Yeah.
know, it was this profound conversation. So I definitely would say I'm more drawn to a kind of intellectual theater, maybe a sort of Neil Simon school of
Mhm.
theater. I like, you know, deep conversations. And My Dinner with Andre, I probably have seen that film 30 times. There was something about that film, which I consider to be a piece of theater, that was so incredible in terms of how it's just literally two men sitting at a table.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine that a film could could perform when it's just one setting. You know, there's maybe one scene of Wallace Shawn walking down the
Mhm.
street leading up or whatever it is. But I think that movie is incredible.
Well, it's funny that you say just two people talking, because I think of, some of Arthur Miller's plays. I think of
Yeah.
took my wife to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. She's like, "What am I in
Mhm.
for?" I'm like, "You get ready," because and then it's just basically the two of them for most of the play, and but
Absolutely.
it's so gripping if
Yeah.
it's right.
Probably one of the smartest things I've ever done for my career. It gave me all the tools that I needed to be able to jump into a new career.
Getting myself into a mindset, thinking like an editor, and being around people that I can talk to on that level was really invaluable to me.
A lot of the things that I learned from that class, I still think about.
I loved the classroom. I loved the computer stations. We built a sense of community.
And it also instills a lot of confidence in you to take that and go out into the world.
After I took the class, I felt very prepared to take the next step.
I owe Manhattan Workshop the career that I have right now.
Things have been going great, and I really have the Manhattan Workshop to thank for that.
Now you're in the process of working on your first directorial debut, Pony, if I'm not mistaken. I'd love
Yes.
to know, how do you feel as a director now? Are you producing it yourself, or are you having a person separately produce it?
I have a producer, Kayla Foster, who
Mhm.
produced You're a Monster, which I think is one of the sharpest movies to come out this year. One of the sharpest movies I've seen in a long time. It premiered at Sundance this year. I'm also working with my daughter, Johnny Sequoia,
Mhm.
and she's working on the film with me, helping me to develop it in a producerial sense, but there's a likelihood she's going to play one of the characters.
Mhm.
I'm exploring the idea. For me, it's still an exploration. It's a story that is based on a true story from my life.
Mhm.
And so in many ways it feels like, I mean, who else could tell this story? It's such a unique period in our history, which is like Central Mountain, Idaho in the
Mhm.
1970s. It was crazy. It was an absolutely crazy time. And and if you didn't have an experience that was somewhat similar or didn't know that world in some capacity, I think it'd be a hard story to tell. it's, it's also a story about my cousin and I getting lost in the backcountry, on our horses because we got cut off by a forest fire. And, Idaho is home to the largest amount of protected wilderness in the lower 48, so second to Alaska. Most of the state is just land, and it's protected by something called the Roadless Areas Act, which is that you cannot drive cars. There's no roads. You can only go in on foot or on horseback. And so it's this very dense wilderness. And one thing about Idaho that's interesting is like, and similar to parts of Canada, like there's still grizzly bears and wolves, and you can't say that of all parts of the states. Like, you don't have grizzly bears in most states in the US, but because of all of this protected land in Idaho, there is still a very wild nature to it. And my cousin and I went into the backcountry. I was 12, she was 16, and a forest fire cut us off from behind. And we just had to keep going. And it took us 2 weeks to get out of there. And it's a wild story. And so I think that my inclination to direct this film, and I have directed documentaries. So I've directed 3 nonfiction films. I have yet to direct anything in the narrative space. And I still consider myself first and foremost a producer. But I'm exploring this idea because it's a really unique story. And I just don't know like who else would tell the story because it's so unique to my life. And it was wild. The experience was wild.
Wow, sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
Oh my goodness. You are gonna laugh. And there is the potential that your viewership is going to judge me. But I love The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City.
Only Salt Lake City? Because my wife watches all of them. Or not all of them, she watches a lot.
I am a Salt Lake City fan,
Yeah.
and because I'm, a multi-generational Idahoan and Utah, and I'm probably related to some of them. But I just think that show, what I think is distinct about it from the other housewives shows, and I have not watched all the other shows for sure, but these are all women that are self-made. I mean, these are not just the rich wives or the wives of rich men. These are women who have built their own businesses, who have, kind of their own unique stamp in the world. They're unapologetic, they're beautiful. I also just love that they're women from Salt Lake City, Utah. They're not in New York or LA or, there's just something about that show that I really love. So that's my guilty pleasure show.
Have you ever listened to, I think it's called Bitch Sesh with it's the podcast that follows
I have.
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah, my wife listens to it, so I've heard it a few times.
Yeah, I mean, truly a guilty pleasure because I'm not into mean girl culture. I far prefer the idea of women, having each other's backs, but there is something that's really fun about it.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com or, of course, on Instagram at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.